Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the fourth session of the Only One Theme Innovation Management Awareness Series. So today is the fourth talk in this series, and we have today Dr. Pushpa, who's going to talk to us on only valuation. Let me briefly introduce Dr. Pushpa. Pushpa is a director at Sathguru Management Consultants and leads the healthcare and life sciences advisory practice. She advises companies on emerging market growth strategies, mergers and acquisition opportunities, portfolio optimization, innovation access, and strategic partnerships. Pushpa converges sector depth and network with knowledge and experience across commercial considerations, regulatory requirements, and IP implications to steer market entry and accelerate growth. Pushpa has also been part of critical policy advisory efforts at the national and international level in areas such as innovation funding, capacity creation in medtech and biopharmaceuticals, skill development, etc. Pushpa leads Sadhguru's engagement with marquee global clients and prolific research institutions. In addition to close to a decade at Sathguru, Pushpa's experience includes technology transfer at University of Michigan and investment banking, advisory at PwC and Ernst & Young. She is a registered technology transfer professional and an MBA from the Ross School of Business at University of Michigan. She is a member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India. Pushpa serves as an alumni advisor to the India Business Conference at the University of Michigan, is a mentor to Ventures on Mass Connect, which is a Massachusetts-based US program, and was recognized as one of the 20 women leaders in healthcare in India in 2018 by MedTech Today. So with this brief introduction, welcome Pushpa to the session and over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Glad to be with you all, and always a fan of smaller group interactions. Would have loved to be in the same room as you all. Again, much more effective if we can see each other and talk, but let that not be a limitation. Please feel free to chime in. Please feel free to add to the discussion. Please feel free to ask questions and make it interactive, because it's always easier that way. The thing is, I got some slides today. I'm going to keep it simple. Going to just have an applied conversation around how we start thinking about valuation. We're not going to get into a lot of nuts and bolts and detailing, and happy to dive into those conversations in the future with any of you who'd like to. There is no one size fits all, which makes this discussion very interesting. This is a subjective exercise, it's always one, but which is where each of our capability to think about the science to markets continuum becomes so relevant. Without giving an introduction, I'm not going to talk about what I do. I recently joined the Board of Governance of the Medicines Patent Pool, and over the course of the last couple of months, been several interesting discussions around, again, some of these transaction structures, valuation, expanding reach of science from the perspective of ensuring everybody has access. So the socio-economic angle to IP advancement and access to IP is also an angle that in the future we can talk about whenever we get a chance to. Some of you all might have an interest at that end. Okay, so stepping back, small administrative detail. I will not be, when I'm on screen share, I won't be able to see hands being raised. So just speak up, stop me, and make a comment, ask a question. Don't raise your hand, I may not see it. It's not going to be rude, it's very welcome to just go ahead and comment.
Yeah, we will be moderating the session, Pushpa, from our end.
Okay, excellent. Go with my first slide. Great. So in terms of, just to get us started, I think, just wanted to first frame the discussion with why we might want to talk about, IP valuation, where is the relevance, how does it come, when and where does it become important in our lives. I think fundamentally, most of us in this conversation must be involved in some way or the other in this continuum of research to impact. We can't undermine importance of basic research and whatever goes on to the left of the spectrum of applied research. But for this conversation, I'm focusing on applied onwards. Applied research moves into translation phase. You are, from maybe in a biological context, studying certain disease area, moving it to understanding of a mechanism, moving it to a target, druggable target, working through that to get through certain candidates, and then finally probably have something you can advance through a validation phase all the way to commercialization. So this is a long drawn effort in terms of getting science to advance through all of those different stages of applied research, through translating it to a solution, which can then go through what is expected of validation for benefit, for safety, and all of those considerations, and then walks through the filter of business and economics to move through commercialization and output in terms of, the economists talk about output as a near-term impact and the outcome. I should be using the word impact for near-term. The output is a near-term realized endpoint. The outcome is a mid-term impact that comes out of that. Right? So at the end of this, you're probably going to see an output of a certain product in the market, or certain commercial sales. The outcome of better solutions to, if it's healthcare, then diseases, better improved health outcomes, all of that over a longer period of time. So the outputs and the outcomes of the final are a great joy to realize in the end. But as we go through this long drawn effort, this is typically a relay with that pattern getting passed on multiple times in this journey. And every time that pattern is passed, you're defining partnership terms. So it becomes, I think, in the context of life sciences, all the more critical because some way or the other, we're part of that journey of passing the baton on from one stakeholder to the next in this critical continuum of activities of advancing science to final socioeconomic output and outcomes. Okay, and what could be those events when those patterns are passed, right? And the final, stakeholders here could be a research institution. A lot of you are from research institutions, some of you are from startups. So a young venture or a startup is also, critical entity in that journey. Large companies have their own role to play, right? But the nature of partnerships, even in a research institution, you may not be doing a direct out licensing. Maybe it's quite early in the journey. I have a lead. I have an expression system, maybe I've developed in my institution, and you've got a molecule you want to express using that. Or I've got a formulation technology and you're a healthcare delivery institution with a use case of how it can benefit a certain indication. So we can co-develop on the expression system that I've developed or on the platform technology for delivery of drugs, and we could develop an application on that. We could optimize the application together. We could advance and validate the application together. So there is significant amount of opportunity to co-create inventions together, to build on the foundation of IP that exists, build new IP or advance IP through all those different steps of validation and development that we discussed. So you could have elements of ascribing value coming in, even when institutions collaborate with each other to advance earlier stage IP or research outcomes to future milestones. You could license outright to a startup you create, could be a spin out on an existing entity. Now that startup might again need to ascribe value at different points in time as a startup raises capital, because the value of that startup really all revolves around the IP in it, the science in it, right? And then the startup could potentially again engage in partnerships. So at that point, again, the life of startup, there is an element of understanding to some extent the value of what they're advancing. The value thus intrinsically in the startup itself as they raise capital, partner, and create value. The large company typically is involved in licensing from the institution. It could license from the research institution
or from the startup, possibly outright acquire the startup to get access to technology. So these are just different ways in which you're seeing science, that baton be moved from one stakeholder to another, or sometimes the baton carried forward together in that overall journey. So the common structures that you see along the way, you've probably heard of licensing as terminology. It's quite a participatory model where you're looking at sharing in that risk that's going to progressively reduce as science is validated and advanced to certain milestones, and as that reward becomes more tangible. Right? So as you advance science through, if it's a new drug, for instance, through preclinical validation, even within preclinical, through initial in vitro studies, through in vivo studies, you are establishing a greater body of proof of concept, and thus defraying technical risk progressively. And as you're doing that, the reward becomes more obvious. And licensing is a model that's going to recognize those milestones. It's going to allow a shared participation in that risk, but also a shared participation in the reward milestones as they come through. It could be certain events within that validation journey, or it could be in the future commercial revenue or sales that starts to flow in at some point. When you're looking at an outright acquisition, is that a large company can come in and acquire, spin out, as is. It's quite a common model for IP to get acquired when a young venture is advancing it. And over there, what is a large company doing? Gilead got the first CAR T-cell therapy came to the world when Gilead acquired Kite Pharma. Kite Pharma came as was a spin out of an Israeli institution. So when you think of the journey of that science, the science started in an Israeli institution, moved into a spin out, and started with government funding in the Israeli institution, moved into a spin out, Kite Pharma, an Israeli spin out, venture capital funded. Then from there moved into, and that time it was licensed into the Israeli spin out. And it got acquired for about $17 billion by Gilead when it was close to market, almost close to FDA approval. Right? And when Gilead acquired it with paying all of that upfront money, they took on that entire risk. And so they paid $17 billion because a significant part of the technical risk was already defrayed by Kite Pharma, which had taken it through, which had done all the heavy lifting in terms of clinical validation with venture capital funding. If they had come in much earlier at phase 1 or at phase 2, the same thing would not have happened, and the valuation would have been significantly different because the level of risk, the visibility was the same, the possible value drivers were the same, but the level of confidence of realizing that risk was different, right? So when you're looking at outright acquisitions, you're thinking a lot more about how to build in the risk and how that would impact the valuation very differently at different stages. So if you're a startup, which is where if you forge a partnership with an institution to validate something on a co-development model, you are actually reducing the risk and then possibly increasing the chances of getting funded or the valuation you get when you're getting funded. So there are pros and cons to those options that you will pursue. But any outright acquisition model is going to entail a lot more thinking on how that risk is going to impact valuation, while in a licensing kind of approach, the structure as is builds that in, because as different milestones are reached, risk as different milestones are reached, there are payments that come through to the licensor, which means that the licensor is shouldering in the possibility that the licensor may not get payments if it doesn't get to certain milestones, or depending on how much success there is, the amount of payment that the licensor will get will be different, right? So the licensing is a lot more participatory model than an outright acquisition. And just framing these here, because whether you're sitting today in a research institution or a young venture or a large company, some fundamental thinking around what is driving the value, how is the other party thinking about ascribing monetary value to what you're doing, what you're advancing, is going to be important as you think about advancing science through that, overall really passing the pattern or holding the pattern along with somebody or taking the pattern from somebody in this long journey. Okay, so here I'm just breaking it down into 3 parts because any place where we're thinking about valuation, I usually go back to my example of buying a house. Today, I'm not so much in the mood to buy real estate, so I'm not going to go to the house story. But, I usually invariably go back to a house to talk about how we would think about, ascribing value to a house that we want to buy or sell, and how would you think about, different scenarios and what would change that value factor in your head. Here, I'm sticking with the science today. Since I'm not in that mood to buy real estate, and science is going to be very different from the house, because you start with the technology, right? I mean, in the house, that element of science-led competitiveness is missing. But hence, it's not as exciting. It's not as much fun to value a house as it is to value, the science that we're advancing the markets. Because fundamentally, that's where this whole activity starts. The heart of it is really in how we've got a technology, an invention, which embodies the science we're advancing, and how that inventiveness is going to finally power business competitiveness or value realization. Right? In between is the whole legal instrument of an intellectual property or a patent, or any other form of intellectual property, which is giving you a protection that's legally enforceable for a certain period of time, and hence makes this competitive ring fencing somewhat stronger, right? Depending on what's the strength of the patent. So it's the science that is encased in this legal instrument that you're really looking at. You're lifting the hood, looking at first starting at the bottom, at the core, of the nucleus of all this, which is really the science that's driving the inventiveness, that is going to drive, that inventiveness is going to drive business competitiveness. So that's the third part. It's realizing value by translating that competitiveness into business value, into economic value, right? But so I'm breaking this down into three parts. And when I think about an IP valuation or ascribing value to anything which is driven by the power of science, I would break my thinking into these three parts here. Start with step one, obsess over it. Really kind of break that down to understand inventiveness, understand how you're powering competitiveness with the science. Then go to the part two, where you're breaking it down into legal instrument. Do I have, patents that can protect this? This is going to be a trade secret. How different is it in different geographies? So you're getting at the legalities or the strength of that patent, or the strength of whatever form of intellectual property is pursued, and how that creates that competitive ring fencing that you're looking for, in terms of me being powered by the science and others not being powered by that science as much, and hence me being able to derive an incremental business value that I can derive because I have the science, right? So it all starts here. I'm going to spend some more time on this. That I think fundamentally, when you're thinking about IP valuation, you're thinking about valuation of any technology-driven asset. I would break it down into three parts. Look at the science and the inventiveness. Think of the legality of the intellectual property and how that protects it, and then go to the business value and how that can be realized. Okay, so let's spend some time at the core. Right? We said the science is where it all starts. That superiority that we're going to get because we have the science is really the power, is the engine at the heart of this. So that engine, break it down, when you're thinking about valuation, break that down into how you're going to benefit from it, right? So how does that give the entity advancing the science, the entity that owns that science, the entity that licenses that science, a certain level of superiority, right? Is there going to be an improved health outcome, right? Do I have a drug formulation that lowers toxicity? Do I have an improved version of Doxil, because of which there is a lower level of incidence of PPE or hand and foot syndrome, and hence, lower toxicity, maybe improves dose tolerance, improves efficacy outcomes in, breast cancer, right? So that is a very strong value proposition because it improves the outcome, the health outcomes in this case, but it could be any other outcome. Can it lower the cost? Right? Do I have here an expression system, or do I have a downstream, an expression system which improves yield, cost of production? Maybe I have some downstream approaches here, which again improve recovery downstream. But finally, is that then resulting in lower cost, either because I can produce more of that product in that same amount of fixed cost, or I just produce more per unit because I've got a high yielding clone, right? So do I have something which lowers the cost? What's the value proposition? Why would somebody adopt this versus state of the current, right? So break it down. You're understanding the science, you're connecting the science to the benefit of what you're going to derive from that, and that superiority over what is currently being used and what's in the pipeline, right? That's a starting point of our thinking when you're thinking of evaluating the science and evaluating the IP. So while we're using the word valuation, let's start with the evaluation, because unless we evaluate it and spend enough time on just understanding the value drivers, we can have a chat about how to do the valuation, but we're not then really, addressing it. We're not approaching it with the depth of thinking at the core, which is the most important part, right? So you're evaluating it, you're assessing how does it compare with the current products. So yes, maybe with the currently marketed standard of care for breast cancer, you're going to demonstrate significant improvement in terms of efficacy. Or maybe it's a new diabetes drug with significantly improved outcomes on glycemic control, right? How does it compare versus pipeline products? Maybe there is a drug in phase 2 or in phase 3 with a way more superior PK/PD profile, and hence has an efficacy, has efficacy claims maybe quite close to what you're claiming. And if that is in phase 2, phase 3, and you're just now in the lab in vitro, by the time you hit that milestone, maybe it's not a significant benefit, right? So we're thinking of superiority, benchmark versus current commercial products, because that's what's most obvious. It's out there. Yields today are maybe 2 grams a liter for a certain biologic, but in the pipeline, in the lab, people are optimizing 8 grams a liter because of certain upstream and downstream changes, right? So you're benchmarking with both. You're benchmarking, maybe you've got a new excipient for cell culture meat. You're comparing with current albumin pricing, $100 a gram. But currently, there are other alternatives to albumin, plant-derived alternatives, which maybe cost $25 a gram, right? So maybe they're not yet in commercial scale, but get a sense for superiority versus commercial products as well as pipeline products, and start there and understand the context of where that value will be realized, right? So the POC antibiotic sensitivity testing, does it address here? It's an example of an antibiotic sensitivity test. Informs the clinician if a person is going to respond to a certain antibiotic or not, and if there is a resistance profile, that should inform the prescription of antibiotic. It will improve, it will enable improved health outcomes, because you are treating the person with an antibiotic that he or she would respond to the first time around. You're not going through that trial and error of seeing if they respond, right? But while I talk about that, let's hold that and come back to it, because there is an element of adoption ecosystem that we probably have to think about when we're thinking of realizing value. But I'm not yet going there. Here, I'm just thinking about what's the value proposition versus what is currently out there commercially versus what's in the pipeline. Is there an obvious benefit? Is it superior? Is there an inventiveness that is representing a value proposition versus state of the current, right? And that could be outcomes, it could be cost, it could be a combination of these. Now, I'm going to go to the middle part. Now, I broke down my thinking into 3 parts. I said I first want to think about how is that science or that inventiveness powering a certain competitive advantage. How is that value proposition encased in the legal instrument of intellectual property? And finally, how are we going to realize that value actually through business activity, right? So now moving from here, yes, we realize that there is, we're comfortable that there is a value proposition. We have a certain hypothesis there, our interactions with inventors, our interactions with industry, we're evaluating a new drug. As my example was, maybe we're talking to clinicians. It's a new expression system. We're talking to people both in manufacturing and R&D. And scale up, understanding what is the current state, and we're validating that there is a value proposition here that the inventor, that the invention's claiming, and that's going to potentially offer a certain competitive advantage in the context we're thinking of. If that's the case, then we're next thinking about translating that inventiveness into an IP protected competitiveness here, right? So how do we think about competitiveness? How do we think about IP as a patent protected or other IP protected competitiveness? Now, I'd like to also break this down into two parts, right? Because many times I start discussing this, and I often see this little hazy discomfort around, well, I don't know if I've got the freedom to move. Well, I think I have the freedom to move. Very good to go. Excellent. I mean, we need to have the freedom to operate. We should be able to practice the claims you want to make without worrying about infringing IP. It's extremely important to commercialize the inventions that we're discussing here. But fundamentally, that doesn't create competitiveness. It allows you to walk down the path you want to walk, right? It doesn't, because I can walk down that path, doesn't give me patentability. It means that somebody else's patent claims are not being infringed by me. I can operate, I can walk down the path, but it doesn't tell me I can restrict others from walking down the path, which is what IP as an instrument gives you, right? So you want to understand inventiveness and patentability to really assess the level of science-led competitiveness in what you're assessing, right? And even if you are, for instance, in licensing from an institution into your startup, you're advancing science in your startup, you don't want to have FTO issues. It's very important. It's putting the house in order, but it does not drive your patent strength, right? Your patent strength is driven by inventiveness. It's driven by differentiation that are in your claims that you're going to restrict others from practicing, right? That preempting right is the core element of this competitive ring fencing, right? So what's the level of patentability in what I have? Is there, do I have strong claims? How does that change geography to geography? How much can I, what's the level of confidence in those claims? If you already filed, for instance, what are your search reports saying, right? And what is the body of IP around this in the geographies where you intend to protect and commercialize? So the science-led competitiveness is going to come out of patentability. And in real life, we've seen this be different in different geographies. The same basket of product, patents, different claims are granted in EU, US, and India, right? So that's reality. So patentability is seen with that lens of what is the body of science, what is the body of other patents there, because sometimes you're getting narrower claims, sometimes you're getting wider claims, but what are you going to be preempting others from making? And because some part of what you're doing maybe is in the public domain. I have no problem on freedom to operate there. That particular mechanism is well understood. Or that particular drug is something we've developed in the past, we've published, we've explored for another indication, and it's all in the public domain. What I'm doing now is I'm optimizing for ophthalmic use. I'm optimizing for A and B. And so what I'm going to create then as patentable inventions maybe is the dose finding and the dosing range for ophthalmic, maybe is optimization or formulation for certain PK/PD for ophthalmic delivery. Now that is where really the inventiveness then lies. If the drug is known and I'm optimizing for ophthalmic, drug is in public domain, I have no FTO issue, I've published it in the past, that's great. The reality is though others can also patent it, right? So when you're thinking about that second block of IP and ring fencing what you have with the legal asset of a patent, the main value proposition that the patent holds out there is that it prevents others from practicing what you have claimed. So that preemption right is the heart of this, and that's limited to what's in your claims, right? So the competitiveness value is going to come from what you're protecting there or what you're protecting by not disclosing, right? You've not filed a patent, but I've got a combination here of optimizing for ophthalmic and maybe a very core element of how the drug is produced, which is a trade secret, which I've not put out in the public domain. So it could be a combination of trade secret and maybe patented claims, But what element of inventiveness are you protecting with intellectual property is really what I think becomes the heart of that second block that we're thinking about in that three-legged effort of what's my science, what's inventive in there, how is that going to drive competitiveness? Next step, how is that protected by the legal asset of intellectual property? Then third, we'll go to how do we realize the value, by actual value, how do you realize the value in use, the value of business commercializing it and taking the product to market. So deriving economic value, here I'm going to the third block. In my three blocks of this is the science, that's the nucleus, that's the heart of it, that drives inventiveness, that inventiveness drives competitiveness. Those competitiveness drivers are ring-fenced by the legal asset of intellectual property. And then here, we're realizing that through having business take that particular science to market, let's scale it up, right? Now, when you're moving from here, from the part of science to IP to markets, the market value realization is going to be driven by multiple factors. The market opportunity is something you're going to clearly think about. Right? If this is a drug for breast cancer, an improved version of Doxil, right? What's the market opportunity for a breast cancer drug with an improved toxicity profile or an improved efficacy profile? Right? Is there a reward for innovation, and how is that going to pan out in different contexts in which you commercialize? Now, the reward for innovation for an improved profile breast cancer drug is going to be quite different in a context where health economics is going to determine pricing and reimbursement. It's going to be different in a context where there is a higher out-of-pocket market, right? So the reward in certain cases, there could be policy elements or regulations or pricing frameworks which determine reward for innovation. Is there going to be a larger market share I can get because of that, that profile of the drug? Which in some ways, what you're seeing in the biosimilar world, you have inventors holding on to a certain drug's market share because they've got a high concentration version, because they've got a certain delivery innovation, maybe even a device play, which the biosimilar entity did not have, right? So the reward for innovation could be in the form of pricing, it could be in the form of market share, it could be in the form of a combination of those as well. Competition, right? Some places you're looking at virgin markets because you've got disruptive technology. Certain cases it's incremental, but the nature of competition is going to be very different. Maybe I've developed an enzyme here, which could be, in certain API, it might have a value for biocatalysis, improving, the overall production economics. And Novozymes is the only one having an alternative to that, right? That's a very, very different landscape from developing a more optimized process to produce phytase, which is produced by 20 companies today, in India, or maybe overall 100 plus companies across the world, right? So competition is going to matter in terms of how you realize value on that science. Barriers to adoption and scale. I spoke about improved Doxil. Maybe I've got a process to bring down the cost of Doxil, but if there isn't a program to pay for scale, it's going to be very different. Now we take our enzyme example. If it is an improved phytase that poultry industry is to adopt, one of your barriers to adoption is that it's largely controlled by 3 large companies. So the structure of the recipient industry on how concentrated it is, even the other extreme of it, I've got a cattle diagnostic for a certain application in cattle. It's extremely fragmented market where the end user is not as informed a buyer, the farmer, and hence the reach to markets beyond 0.5% is with respect to what kind of distribution marketing partnerships I explore there. Right? So I've taken an example of 2 ends of the animal health industry, where if I've got certain innovations to scale up there, the considerations around adoption are actually going to be extremely different than regulations, right? Very, very different ways plays a part in pricing, plays a part in adoption, plays a part as a barrier to adoption, as an enabler of adoption, and plays a part in terms of how that changes across different applications and could actually inform how you advance the science as a startup doing so, or as an institution licensing, amongst those different applications, by taking cognizance of how regulations will impact that. Right? So a practical example, and this is a portfolio of IP that with value of an algal platform that could be used to produce a couple of different products, one being DHA, which is a food ingredient. And the more you think about, so the science is clear there. You've been able to benchmark the science, you looked at the patterns. Now we're thinking about how will you realize business value on that? And the context in which it'll be commercialized becomes so important, right? So if you look at precedents of algal DHA and commercial presence, adoption of technology in the global context, in an application such as infant food, there is a high adoption, and DSM is an algal DHA, which has a very high adoption in infant food, but not in other segments, right? Because there's a great sustainability claim there, because it's a replacement for fish meal in other feed opportunity as well. But the others are way more price sensitive and not as sensitive to contamination as the infant food application. So in the infant food, there's a specific FDA trigger for using a cleaner process, which is this algal production of DHA versus getting DHA from a marine source. So the regulation has been a trigger for adoption of algal DHA in infant food, despite this particular technology not having as price competitive an output with the current solution, which is marine DHA. And despite the lack of price competitiveness, because of the regulatory trigger, the infant food has been an attractive market segment. And there are strong dynamics for continued adoption in that space. But the economics and competitiveness required for the rest of the applications, feed included, is very different. So when you're looking for comfort on how to think about what can you achieve in the markets with the science, what kind of a competitive advantage and market value realization the science can translate to, you find much greater confidence, much stronger indicators for adoption and scale in infant food as compared to other applications for that particular portfolio of algal DHA. Right? That's an example of where regulations actually played a significant part in impacting opportunity for business value realization. Right? And so also, overall ecosystem considerations on reward for innovation or adoption dynamics. Another example here is an antimicrobial coated catheter. Clearly had data, this was an American spin-out, had very good data showing that use of this antimicrobial coated catheter had an impact, had a positive impact in terms of reduction of ICU infections, which in a payer-driven market, they were able to demonstrate that because you reduced ICU infections and number of hospitalization days, there was a saving of north of $10,000, and hence they were able to establish a certain pricing premium for their antimicrobial coated catheter in a system where the health economics with a qualified payer is how prices are determined for consumables such as this. But in an out-of-pocket market, that's a tough discussion to have, and it's difficult to take that value proposition to realized price or a reward for innovation. So I just wanted to break up these two practical examples to discuss how regulations or reward for innovation context had a significant bearing on how the same science would have a different value realization opportunity, in different applications or in different geographies. I've got a few more examples, more to walk through this thinking that we've just spoken about in terms of going through those 3 steps, thinking about science, thinking about the IP, thinking about the markets, but really here thinking a little bit more qualified about the markets. Because the first thing that I wanted to kind of top load is if you're approaching this from the angle of, I want to ascribe a value, I want to start thinking in a more qualified way about value. The big numbers that we find with the Google search are good as an initial guide, but only for that, only for framing our knowledge around that application, not so much for actually the detailing around or a more nuanced thinking around ascribing value. Here I'll take, this is a carrier protein used in conjugated vaccines. Let's assume you're a spin-out that has optimized a process to produce CRM197 that's used as a carrier protein for a range of conjugated vaccines, right? So take all of those vaccines, global market easily north of $6 billion. It's used in the pneumococcal PCV, pneumococcal conjugate vaccine. Pfizer itself sells north of $5 billion of the PCV, right? So, and then there are emerging opportunities like the typhoid conjugate vaccine. So looking at value of conjugated vaccines is a starting point there, but use that for framing, right? If I'm going to go to a venture capitalist to raise capital, let's say I got CRM 197, and I link my value thinking to that $6 billion, I'm not breaking it down enough to show that I understand the value drivers and understand the nuances of realizing that value, because that's an addressable total market for the final product that is made using this carrier protein, or of which this carrier protein is a component, right? So start thinking bottom up about the drivers of value there, right? Which vaccines can it be used for? I mean, it's being used in the hemophilus influenza type B, but that is, smaller market opportunity by volume, very mature, taken market. In terms of current and emerging, the pneumococcal conjugate and the typhoid conjugate vaccine could be two vaccines it's used for. Map that pipeline. Who's making it? What stage are they? Is there, what is the value proposition? Is the value proposition going to be that your recombinant carrier protein is significantly cheaper? Is it more stable? What's the advantage of that, right? And is there an opportunity to target adoption? Because if these products are approved, changing a significant component like a carrier protein is near impossible to do. I mean, it's possible. Today, there are in fact clones being changed in for trastuzumab because the economic benefit is so high, it's justifying it. But it's a humongous task. It's not easy to do it all. And to understand the stage where it is, if in fact a product's even passed through preclinical and the company is on a marathon race to hit markets by a certain period, they're unlikely to change a component today, but they could possibly use a follow-on product if they have it. So understand this, understand what are the nodes for entry into that market, right? So the targetable customers are important because this is a consolidated space. There are only about 10 vaccine companies developing conjugated vaccines. Once you know what's the pipeline, are they early on for you to approach? And potentially, can you get, 2 out of those, depending on where those markets are, can you target 2 out of those, right? And what would be their share? And can you quantify more meaningfully an addressable opportunity for your CRM197 based on that? Really would be a more nuanced way to think about markets. So it's good to start with the idea that the global vaccine market, 6 billion, but as a word of caution, use that only to frame your thinking, but really dive in from there, break it down into parts, like how we broke down competitiveness, like how we broke down patentability, break down the market into components, and think about, how you can work through that in a way that you have comfort around what's addressable. I'm not saying be conservative, but break it down in a way that you have a qualified understanding of what is doable here. Okay, I kept going back to improved version of Doxil. I think that it's actually a case that actually worked on, and so also CRM197. But this particular case here, this is an improved version of Doxil. Doxil is a very successful oncology drug from Janssen. It is used in 3 different cancer indications. The claim here, and this actually came from the inventor of Doxil, the value proposition is very strong. Doxil does have significant side effects like most oncology drugs. So PTE is a side effect that is very dilapidating for patients treated with Doxil. That initially was hard to find. You can ascribe value on paper based on what you perceive, but the realization of that seemed hard, right? And how it was repositioned is really going back to connecting the dots between that value proposition in the markets, where if you looked at which indication that particular side effect was dose limiting, there was one out of those 3 where because you're addressing a dose limiting indication, a side effect, the value proposition enhanced substantially because it meant that the treatment outcomes were significantly better. People instead of dropping out, continue on treatment because it addressed a dose limiting side effect. it became a significant value proposition in terms of that value getting realized in terms of economic benefit, right? But here again, you're thinking of the subset of so ovarian cancer patients, a subset for whom Doxil is dose limiting, and then a smaller subset out of the larger group where they would pay a premium for a lower toxicity drug, and taking that through to thinking on realizable market value. I'm not going to go into a lot of details on how we take what we just discussed as that three-part thinking on science to IP to market value into a final number, but I will have a very brief discussion on that. And again, happy to dive into that in the future with you all. But there are, as you would have heard in the past, three broader methods where you think about using what's gone in historically as a cost, think about value. We've invested $5 million in this research program so far. That's the cost method, right? What's the market method, which is, in fact, these two are the more commonly used approaches. You could be driven by cost when you're thinking of cost as a floor value to realize in a certain transaction, or when you're thinking of ascribing value to a venture, for instance. It's not common. You want to be more value. You want to be value based on what value you can create in the future, and which is the income method. Hence, it does have a lot more. It does involve a lot more subjectivity, but it will give you a much more reliable. It will give you a more robust reflection of value if we're able to work through reliable projections. If we're able to work through projections with a certain confidence on what kind of value can be realized, right? My example with the improved Doxil, you're breaking down addressable population pool, understanding where that science has maximum value. Maybe IP protection is strong in 2 countries, thinking through in those how you can price that benefit, and then taking that in the income method into realizable value. The market method is one where you look at comparable transactions. Another oncology drug of incremental innovation was licensed by another institution with X upfront, X royalty, and these kind of milestones, right? So those are comparable transactions. Comparability is important. You're understanding how other startups were valued with a similar IP, similar science value proposition as yours, how other transactions were structured with somewhat comparable assets in them. So these are the 2 more common methods. You're often guided by benchmarks and comparables, but I'm a big fan of back of the envelope income approaches. I think it gives you a lot of comfort as you're going in to discussions, because you're understanding the licensee's perspective. You got a better sense of the markets, and you can co-learn with them. I mean, the company, your partner, if that's a partner who's going to handle scale up, commercialization, is going to understand this market a lot better. But participate in that in a collaborative way, leverage their own understanding to work through that, right? And you become, as you engage in that process, the confidence with which you navigate the transaction becomes very different. Okay, I know in the interest of time, we had an hour, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detailing on how you would go about doing this. But broadly, like we discussed, take an example of the improved Doxil. You know the opportunity you're addressing is protected in the US and it's protected in India. Think of the relevant geography and operating model. What is the addressable population pool? How can I price the value proposition of improved tolerance, lower toxicity, dose-limiting side effect getting addressed in that geographic context with that population and that channel, and then model in that incremental revenue you can create. You discount that, you get that to attributable value to your IP. This is what's normally done in a more rigorous exercise. But I'm going to go into not these examples, but this, because this is a back of the envelope approach, and I will stop with this. So here I'm just walking through a simple thought process on how we can do what I just spoke about in a back of the envelope approach, not with a lot of financial modeling, but a simple exercise to give us comfort as we engage, as we're thinking about the value of the science we're advancing, or if we're having discussions with potential partners, right? So in this case, it's a diagnostic for cattle I'll not get into what indication to be conscious of sensitivity that this is an actual case. It's come out of an institution, it's got POC, with a grant, they validated that versus current standard of care diagnostic established high level of sensitivity and specificity. Right? If I had to think about if I have to start thinking about valuation in this case, I've had conversations with the inventors, I've had conversations with the industry to understand what's out there, spoken to a veterinarian or two to get an understanding of the value proposition. And so we've got a basic information in place to be able to start thinking back at the envelope about this particular invention. Starting with, I've got to get a sense for, value proposition. Yes, if there is an early, the advantage of the science here is that if there is an early diagnosis of this indication, it's useful. This one was actually a cow site diagnostics. It could be done in the farm. It is a POC, very simple to do. Currently, it is a lab-based test. And hence, there was a strong value proposition. Patents were filed in India, so we're discussing only India. So we've discussed, value proposition. We validated some of that thinking with veterinarians. We validated some of that thinking with industry and a pharma. But now, thinking, you looked at the IP, you got comfort that there are strong claims in the patent filed in India. Right now, what they're looking at the third piece and how we're going to realize value there. You'll find a lot of big picture numbers on Indian animal health, cattle markets. I'll again be cautious with that. But there are about 200, 300 million cows in India, for instance. Right? NDP publishes that. You know that. There is literature on indication on this condition, per se. Get a sense for that. Conversations with industry. We spoke about how poultry is so different from cattle in India. While poultry is so concentrated, cattle is very fragmented. So you're looking at a very fragmented market. The best examples are 2-3% market shares. So getting a market share is tough. The company is 100 crore in animal health in India. They're happy. It's a big milestone. So it does take a lot of effort to scale up the reality of that industry, as well as adoption for a new test like this, because there is no cow site test for this indication or for most indications. This has to be done a certain way. It involves education, awareness. So considering all of that, you've got some thinking on penetration. So you've got some thinking on pricing too, having spoken to veterinarians, understanding how current tests are priced. So yes, there is a range of 20 to 50 rupees where there's a great comfort. There is a range of 50 to 150 rupees, but there's lesser comfort on level of use. Right? You've got some sense of what it will cost at a COGS level to produce this. So you've given this a simple back of the envelope approach, a small Excel table, gives you a comfort on what you can possibly look at as a total market, cows, penetration, pricing, right? Gives you a sense for what an individual licensee it would capture with the level of penetration. Take that back, and if you are, in a fragmented industry like this, you're likely to think of multiple partnerships rather than one exclusive partnership, right? So, you're looking at a market share of 3 of them, collectively 10%, collectively, 12%, being a potential market reach of that. So the implication for an individual license is understood, but implication for institution, you're doing a non-exclusive 3 licenses in the space. What does that mean for penetration? I get a good sense for what could be annual value realized and what a licensee could benefit from. Because from an institution standpoint, yes, we've probably invested 50 lakhs in this so far. What is our recovery on that? If that's a line of thought with it. But also from the licensee standpoint, what can they generate annually and how are your terms justified, right? Maybe historical benchmark here in reality could have been 3 lakhs a test in upfront in licensing. If you're trying to restate that, get 8 lakhs in upfront. Now, are you in a position to negotiate it? Do you have the content to engage in that discussion with, Vetapanol or Zoetis or Zydus or whomever you're talking to, right? So a simple approach like this brings in comfort to engage in that conversation. And if you are a licensee, licensing this from the institution, approach gives you comfort for if you're paying 3 lakhs, if you're taking on a 5% royalty, what can you generate as value and how does that fit into that overall picture? I will stop here in the interest of time, but I just wanted to have a very practical discussion here around how, it is a 3-part journey always. The heart of it is the inventiveness, is the science-led competitiveness. The layer on that is the IP or the legal protection. There is no layer on it. if the nucleus is not there, right? So start there, the nucleus is the value proposition. How are we encasing that value proposition? And what are the practical considerations for realizing that value proposition, right? So that's the broader approach, but happy to answer questions. I know I'm 2 minutes from close time, so I will stop talking now.
Yeah. Hi, thanks, Pushpa, for this detailed talk. I think very well explained with so many examples given. Such a difficult topic, but you made it quite elaborate. So yeah, and there are no questions right now in the chat box, but let me open the forum for any questions that the audience may have. In case anyone has questions, feel free to raise your hand and we will unmute you. Meanwhile, I can ask my colleagues who are part of this meeting. If anyone of you has a question, you can unmute yourself and ask your question. Okay, my colleague has put the feedback link in the chat box. So please do give us your feedback for this today's session. Pushpa, people have not raised their hands up till now. I think your talk was such an elaborate one, or maybe they might have few more questions later on. In case there are any, will you be okay to take them up over email or something?
Sure.
Yeah. And also we will request you to share a shareable version of your presentation, which we will share with the participants via our restricted website. There's one more. So yeah, there's one question from Dr. Hardeep Vora. Hardeep asks, how does licensing in any one territory impact licensing fees in another?
Sure. What should we see? I think, so it depends on what the territory is. Now, in my example of cattle licensing, territory can be part of India. In a broader context, in my Doxil example, territory can mean US versus India, right? And there is likely to be significant difference in how value can be realized in US versus India for an improved Doxil. So there could be differentiation in value, and there should ideally be also differentiation in value. Now, if you're doing a combined global license, you don't break it down. But if I'm doing regional licensing, the upfronts and milestones for India likely to be lower than China, likely to be significantly lower than US or Europe. If I do all of LATAM together, again, it's going to be different from breaking up Brazil to smaller market like Peru. Now, there I'm talking about the upfronts and milestones because you're going to stage that down to value that can be realized. Is there going to be a difference in royalty rates? There can be if the profitability is likely to be different. So when you're thinking about connecting a licensing structure to thinking on valuation, the rule of thumb would be that you think about royalty rates at about 20 to 25% of overall cash profitability of that segment. Which, if I had to take an example in generic drugs, for instance, you would see EBITDA of 25%. You see generic drug getting licensed with royalties of maybe mid single digits to late single digits, right? 8%, 5%, 6%, maximum 12%. Not going to be higher than that. If you take a novel drug, it is double digits for sure because the profitability is different. So similarly, if in India your value realized or the pricing is going to be, profitability is going to be 20% because the pricing is different, you could stage royalties as well. You could also do differentiation by market channel. So I can have a different royalty for sales to public health or government channels, and I can have a different royalty for sales in private markets because the profitability is intrinsically different. So you can have differentiation in either a single license based on market channel or geography. You can also do multiple licenses for regional licensing where you are reflecting such similar changes in terms of either the overall value to be realized, which gets reflected in upfront milestones, or profitability, which gets reflected in royalty.
Thanks, Pushpa. All right. So if there are no more questions, thanking you once again for this wonderful session and making time from your schedule for taking this session for us. So thank you very much once again.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right. So for the attendees, we will be having our next session now on 8th of November. So happy festive season to all of you. And we will meet again on Tuesday, 8th November for our upcoming session in this innovation only one theme series. Thank you once again.
Bye-bye.
Bye.